It's a case study of basically of George Grant. So a case study of violence in the Mongolian frontier of George Grant, born in 1876, died in 1913, hence the summer of 1913. The first major war between Mongolia and China in the 20th century, the first one that had occurred in hundreds of years. So he was a Scottish employee of the Chinese Telegraph Administration, and he was killed by Inner Mongolian troops in the summer of 1913. This tragic case, as it's framed through the British and the Western publics, in newspapers and in travel accounts, very quickly becomes part of what I'm calling the Orientalist archive about Mongolia. And so these are all these documents, thousands and thousands of documents and news articles and stories and what have you that represent Mongolia in very exceptional ways, in some cases in mythical ways in the 20th century. So here's our source of assumptions about Mongolians, stances about Mongolians, all this type of knowledge is being created for Western readers by Western writers, again, about Mongolia and Mongolians. Now, the death of George Grant himself may not be significant for Mongolian studies researchers. It was a formative event, though, for the expatriate community in China and Mongolia at that time. But now the circulation of this tragedy, the circulation of George Grant's death, is what makes it significant and a highly productive way to explore, again, how, in this case, Americans are being taught about Mongolia, about what the common sense of Mongolia is. As a news event itself, the death of George Grant is no longer important after the spring of 1914. In fact, during the following year, an American female journalist, Olive Gilbreth, thanks for Salvo for finding this article for me, right? She travels to where Grant died north of Zhangjiakou or Kalgan. I'll picture that in a little bit. She mentions the Mongolian military leaders who were held responsible for Grant's death, Morunga and Sarenbo. If any of you know more about these two military leaders, I'm going to grab you during the lunchtime because I'm trying to learn much more. Right? And she mythologizes one of them. Mongolians are a race that still breeds a Morenga, as she writes, who in the 20th century strung his tents with hearts cut from living victims! Exclamation mark. Right? Surprising, however, she fails to mention Death's Grant in connection to her description of this horrid Morunga character. As a story that exists in the Orientalist archive about Mongolia and that teaches American, British, and other Western readers about Mongolia, Grant's death reappears throughout the 20th century. And as we see, it's going to reappear in cowboy westerns in the 1950s in men's magazines. Okay? And so basically, my modus operandi is I'm going to be guiding you through the death of Grant and its official story. And then we're going to jump 40 years to 1953. I'm going to guide you through how the story has been represented again for a new audience and a distant American audience in these magazines. So here we go. So there's good old Grant, right? George Grant. Sometimes I get emotional when I think about it. So he's a guy in a black and white striped shirt, right? So if I break down in tears, don't worry. I've been doing experiential research. I've been trying to cover where he was in China and Mongolia. And I've met his great nephew, is a guy roughly my age, a bit older than me, who lives in the Scottish Highlands. And so I've been doing new types of research that I'd never been able to do before. So he was born in Skelmerley on the western coast of Scotland, again in 1876. And he appears on the national census in 1891 as a baker's apprentice. Though I know nothing about how he becomes connected to the telegraph, travel, and expatriate community in northern China, Grant next appears in 1903 as an employee in Beijing for the Eastern Extension Australia and Chinese Telegraph Company, one of several large international telegraph companies that modernized Chinese communications at the end of the 19th century. In 1908, Grant works as an interpreter and general manager for the Robert Clark and Arthur D. Sowerby expedition in northern China. There again, black and white shirt. Responsibilities that indicate he was fluent in Chinese and that he was comfortable traveling in northern China and interacting with the many Mongolian and other ethnic groups that he encountered. He was an avid photographer, which probably prompted his death, to be honest, right? And a hunter. More tragically, and important for the purposes of this presentation, Grant experienced violence also on this expedition. So the team's Indian surveyor, Hazrat Ali, was killed by a group of Chinese villagers. Now, after a visit to the United States to meet his younger brother, Grant returns to China in the fall of 1911. In the April of 1913, he takes a position with the Chinese Telegraph Administration under his friend Herbert Forbes Henningsen, the Beijing superintendent of this telegraph company. They traveled together from Kalgan, right, or as it's now called Zhangjiakou, so this sort of brand new area that they built during the COVID period, sort of a Mongolian village of sorts. And if you go through the gate, you go into the Mongolian frontier. So they traveled from Kalgan to Ude, so north of our contemporary Zamihud, where Henningsen leaves him and continues his tour to the northern telegraph stations in Tuiren, right by Choyahi, by the Choya Monastery, Hure, Ulaanbaatar these days, and Kyakhta. So in a June 9th letter to George Morrison, June 9th, 1913, letter to George Morrison, who's a Western advisor to Yuan Shikai, the president of the very new Republic of China. Grant reports that he was glad to accept this position for which he was more or less fit. In this case, he's talking about his skills as an adventurer, his ability to take photographs, to hunt, to solve problems, and probably to be a peacekeeper as well with the many Mongolian and Chinese groups that he encountered. And so it's important to note why Grant, a British citizen, was hired for a position in a public Chinese company. In this case, the telegraph lines and the stations were in highly isolated areas and vulnerable to attack, especially by Mongolian soldiers who may have considered the telegraph a foreign or Chinese extension into Mongolian space, or even more simply, by Mongolian herders who were tempted by such an easy source of wood and wire. So Europeans were hired to be the face of this organization, this Chinese organization, and that made it much more acceptable to local Mongolians. Now, after Henningsen leaves Grant. Grant returns to the first telegraph relay station, which is Pongqiang, here transliterated as Bongqiang, on the southern edge of the Gobi Desert, which we would now sort of see called the Boron Sunu Posho, the Boron Sunu Banner. And this is as close as I get to figure out where the telegraph station perhaps once was. I thank the Chinese government for not arresting me wandering around the countryside during a very sort of politically tense period last year. And so this was in the middle of what we now call the Tabanzami Baildan, so the Battle of the Five Roads. Right? So a little known battle between Inner Mongolian and Eastern Mongolian troops and Republic of China troops. And so this telegraph station was right in the middle of it. There's the letter of George Grant, which when I found that, again, it was one of those miraculous moments, similar to finding arrowheads and burial grounds as well, in a way. Here's a map by a British, somebody connected to the British military, and so his mapping of the different battle areas at this period. And so the one we're interested in here is this line in the middle. So we're going from Zhangjiakou or Kalgan through Tabel, where Franz Larsen had a horse farm, and there's a large Scandinavian mission there, to Pongqiang, to Ude, to Tuiren, and then up to Hure or Urga or Ulaanbaatar. And so this you can tell as well as now where the road is, and now where the train is as well. And so what happens at this period is that this telegraph station is under lots of duress because it's the supplies are being requisitioned by the Inner Mongolian troops, who are led, according to Grant, by three individuals that I find interesting. One is old Chief Pao, who I know nothing about, right? Pei Ying, who's a Manchurian Mongolian who led the most threatening of all the troops. And then, of course, Morunga, whom Grant describes as the third in command. And Morunga will be blamed officially for Grant's death. Now, Morunga is associated with several Inner Mongolian and Manchurian military figures, including Namsarai, who surrendered and shifted his allegiance in 1913 to Yuan Shikai. He's also associated with Tuktai Taich and Bawojao, right? So again, well, very sort of fabulous, interesting characters during the autonomous period. A socialist era Mongolian source narrates the meeting of Murunga with Tuktai Taich, the infamous Mongolian guerrilla fighter who attacked Chinese settlements in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia. In a chance meeting approximately 5 to 10 years before 1913, Murunga announces his identity to Tuktai. I am the hero Murunga of the Mongol Jin banner of the Zasset League, when he claims his troops are from the Sakha Mongolian ethnic group. Again, unfortunately, I know nothing about the other two commanders that Grant mentions. Other descriptions of these Inner Mongolian troops indicate that Murunga was the leader, and that his second in command was the less trustworthy and more violent Saran Mo, who's also sometimes called Norbu. Oscar Mammon, in his unpublished memoir, reports that Murunga was part of Namsarai's peace deal, and he was also meant to surrender. However, his battles with the Chinese were so easy, and he was making so much money off of these attacks that he decided that, it was too easy. He decided to remain on the Mongolian or Inner Mongolian side. Now to get to what's like the detective story part of it. Right? So, on approximately June 17th, Grant leaves for Kelgan with 3 Chinese telegraph employees to retrieve more supplies for the station. Halfway to Kelgan, however, probably right around the Kabul area, 5 mountains, 5 hills, he was intercepted by Murunga and Sarambo's troops, who then detained Grant and the telegraph employees and then execute them around June 21st. The story continues though. Afterwards, on June 30th, Oscar Mammon, a Norwegian employee of the British American Tobacco Company in Korea, is contacted by Henningsen about Grant's disappearance. Mammon meets several times with the head of the Mongolian government, the Sanoy Khan, as well as with Alexander Miller, and he was sort of the main Russian diplomatic agent in Korea at the time, to find a way to communicate with these troops and release Grant. Of course, his efforts were unsuccessful because Grant had already been executed. On July 4th, a search party consisted of his good friend Henningsen, the head of this telegraph company, and a group of Westerners, was detained by Murunga soldiers. And so here we're talking about this guy Henningsen, we're talking about some newspaper correspondence, and we're talking about, quote unquote, an American cowboy in the service of the VAT. And this is a character called Fred Meyer Schroeder, and I'll be mentioning him again in the second half, and real quickly. So this search party reportedly met with Murunga and collected enough of Grant's personal possessions to prove his death. So on July 9th, the Times reports, so there's Henningsen, by the way, on the right. On July 9th, the Times reports Grant's death for the first time, and then it's officially communicated to the British Parliament on August 7th. Now this is important. In early September, a Mongolian associate of Larsen locates Grant's remains, which were then sent to Beijing on September 15th. After an autopsy, there was a funeral ceremony for Grant, and his body was buried in the English cemetery near the West Gate of Beijing on September 19th. Murunga remains a key military commander in Inner Mongolia. He was awarded a new title by the Bokhan in the fall of 1913, and he won one of the last battles in 1913. So this is from a November 18th article, where Murunga soldiers killed 400 Chinese troops north of Kalgan, this similar area. And at the very end, Murunga finally meets his end at the beginning of 1914. Murunga, as it's written here, was shot in his sleep in his camp to the north of Kalgan on January 17th. It is stated that the deed was done by the order of the Urga government, who since the conclusion of the Russo-Chinese agreement have endeavored to restrain the activities of the Mongol bands in the frontier region. And then one of the British administrators wrote, "A pity he was shot in his sleep." There we have Fred Meyer Schroeder. I'm going to be quick on this because our lunch is coming up in about 5 or so minutes. So now everyone, we're going to jump to 1953. Okay? And we're going to jump to this interesting magazine, which I finally found a real copy of the other day. So True, the Man's Magazine, right? If you ever see anything in an amazing published called True, you know nothing is actually true in it, right? So these were fabulously popular magazines at the time, right? So this, I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but this had a monthly circulation of 1.9 million American readers. And so this was being circulated all over the place, right, in the United States. And so this is so this appears then in 1953, called The Death of Malunga, by Fred Meyer Schroeder, as told to Robert Easton. And then by the time we get to later accounts, so this is in 1978, now we have sort of taken off Fred Meyer Schroeder, and he just seems to be a source of information. And now Robert Easton is the main author of this, right, in Guns, Gold, and Caravans. And then a few years later, it appears yet again in China Caravans. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit and just sort of show you how this story that I've already told you, which is the official account, this shows up in why the Chinese government gave George Grant's mother, for example, $1,000. And then we see what happens when we take this story and we move it 40 years to an American audience. And we put it into a new genre called the cowboy tale, right? The cowboy western. Which, if you've never read one, I've only read a very few, right? But they're fabulous stories, usually about solitary males on horses and having duels, right? So I'm going to read you a duel scene in a second. Right? So here's what he does, right? I'm going to list a few of the obvious ways. So first of all, this guy called Schroeder, who was a very minor character in the official story, he now becomes the central focus of this mystery, right? So he takes on the central role. Grant is changed as well. So Grant becomes less of a working class Scottish person and a representative of the global and modern world. He was the reason why the telegraph was being taken across the Mongolian grasslands, even though he wasn't even in Mongolia or China when these telegraphs were being built, which they were finished by 1899. So they imagined this is the reason why George Grant was killed. So to explain Grant's death, Schroeder and Easton imagined a meeting with Morunga to negotiate the protection of the telegraph lines. After an agreement is made, Grant walks away from the camp and is shot by Morunga in the back of the head. Morunga's men then kill Grant's Chinese assistant, and then Morunga as well has changed substantially. He's no longer a military leader. He's now a bandit who is committed to protect the grasslands of Mongolia and sort of protect Mongolian culture from these modern elements. He also becomes a Buddhist Lama as well, which is an interesting detailed change. After Grant's death, Schroeder then becomes the center of the action. Motivated by his bonds of friendship with Grant, he and a Mongolian companion travel to Morunga's abandoned camp to find Grant's body. Schroeder collects Grant's bones and whatnot because the Mongolian is too afraid to go into this area. Right? Again, we have a complete difference here in this story. Again, Schroeder has to be the main hero. Now it gets really interesting. Schroeder and the assistant then travel north of the Great Wall and track down Morunga in his new camp. After observing his routine for several days, they use the telegraph to notify the military officials in Urga, who agreed to send down a group of 60 soldiers. Schroeder, leading one of the groups of soldiers, attacks Morunga's camp early in the morning. Easton then depicts the narrator of the story, Schroeder, and Morunga participating in a duel, this ubiquitous Western plot element to conclude the conflict between two characters. Now I'm going to conclude then by reading this duel scene. Again, for those of you who have never read a cowboy Western, I'll even act it out a little bit. He had a rifle in his hands, just as I did. This is Morunga coming out of his gear, right? I spotted him at the same moment he spotted me. So in a duel, you have to be looking at each other, right? That's the only manly way to kill somebody, right? You can't be like Morunga and kill Grant in the back of the head. That's a complete violation of the manly code of the Western. Then for the first time, he knew who was after him. Me, Schroeder, the American cowboy, right? I guess he remembered Grant then. I wanted him. I guess he wanted me. We started walking toward each other. Sounds like a nice Hollywood film, right? We were about 125 yards or meters apart when we started. We had got to 75 yards when he raised his gun. I fired from the hip. Firing from the hip, right? He stopped and pitched forward on his face. He tried to raise his rifle and shoot me at once, then lay still. I thought he was dead. We'll just leave it there. I think you get the picture. Thank you. So this comes from another cowboy story about life on the caravan trail between Hure, between Burga, as you would call it, and Kalgan. And again, you can see it's very easy to take the entire Gobi Desert and all the Mongolian grasslands, the Mongolians themselves, and you just shift it into the American West. And then you have Schroeder here, who becomes the hero of the story with what's just again just out of a Western, even sort of a Western landscape in that. Thank you.